On November 24, 2009, John Edward Jones entered Nutty Putty Cave in Utah for a Thanksgiving night adventure with his brother. 27 hours later, he was dead, trapped upside down in an 18-inch crevice, his body crushed by gravity and limestone. The cave was sealed with concrete, entombing him forever. But that's not the story the internet remembers. Instead, thousands have shared the legend of Marcus Chen, an experienced spelunker who vanished in the same cave in 2011. According to the story, search teams found only his backpack near a passage called Ed's Push. 5 years later, ground-penetrating radar detected an impossible chamber behind the concrete seal. Inside, helmet cam footage showed Chen had survived alone for 3 years, documenting ancient markings on limestone walls. His final video entry, recorded in failing darkness, captured him backing away from the camera, whispering, "Something's down here with me. It's been watching this whole time." The footage was immediately classified. The chamber was resealed, except none of it happened. Marcus Chen never existed. No hidden chamber was discovered. No ancient markings, no classified footage, no government cover-up. But John Edward Jones did die in Nutty Putty Cave, and the way internet mythology has consumed his death, transforming a preventable tragedy into supernatural entertainment, reveals something unsettling about how we process loss in the digital age. This is the story of how a real person's final hours became someone else's creepypasta. The Marcus Chen story follows a familiar pattern. It appears in Reddit threads about unexplained disappearances, in YouTube comment sections beneath cave diving videos, in TikTok compilations of mysteries that were never solved. The details vary slightly depending on who's telling it, but the core remains consistent. Marcus Chen was an experienced solo spelunker who entered Nutty Putty Cave in Utah on an unspecified date in 2011. He was comfortable in tight spaces, methodical in his exploration, the kind of caver who kept detailed logs and never took unnecessary risks. He told friends he planned to map an unexplored section near Ed's Push, a notoriously difficult passage that required technical maneuvering through near vertical compressions. He never emerged. The search operation, according to the legend, lasted weeks. Teams scoured every known passage, calling his name into the darkness, checking and rechecking the tightest squeezes where someone might become wedged. They found his backpack positioned carefully against a wall near Ed's Push. Inside, water bottles, protein bars, mapping equipment, spare batteries. Everything suggested he'd set up a base camp and intended to return. But Marcus Chen had vanished. The case went cold. The cave, already controversial after previous incidents, was permanently sealed with concrete in what authorities described as a public safety measure. For 5 years, Nutty Putty remained closed, a concrete plug blocking the entrance, the passages beyond slowly returning to geological silence. Then came the discovery. In 2016, according to the viral story, structural engineers were surveying the sealed sections to plan a memorial expansion. Ground-penetrating radar detected an anomaly. A massive chamber that appeared on no existing cave maps, located directly behind the concrete seal. The void measured roughly 40 feet across and 20 feet high, impossibly large for a cave system that consisted primarily of narrow crawlways and vertical slots. When they carefully drilled through the seal and lowered a camera, they found Marcus Chen's camp, or what remained of it. The helmet cam footage, supposedly recovered from the chamber and later classified by local authorities working with federal agencies, tells the rest of the story. The timestamps span nearly 3 years. In the earliest recordings, Chen appears calm, almost clinical. He'd fallen through a false floor into an unmapped section and couldn't climb back out. The chamber had a small groundwater seep that kept him alive. He rationed his supplies with mathematical precision, But survival wasn't his focus. The limestone walls were covered in markings, not modern graffiti or the expected mineral deposits, but deliberate symbols carved into the rock, geometric patterns that didn't match any known Native American petroglyphs or historical cave art. Chen became obsessed with documenting them, measuring them, attempting to decode their arrangement. The footage shows his physical deterioration, weight loss, beard growth, the gradual degradation of his clothing and equipment. But his documentation never stopped. He created detailed sketches by headlamp light. He recorded observations in a voice that grew hoarser but remained focused until the final entry. The timestamp places it approximately 3 years and 2 months after his disappearance. The battery indicator blinks red. Chen positions the camera on a rock facing himself. The light is barely sufficient to distinguish his features. He's emaciated, his eyes reflecting the LED with an animal brightness. He whispers, "I thought I was alone down here. I was wrong." A pause. It doesn't move when the light's on it, but I can hear it when the batteries die each night. It's breathing, or something like breathing. Another pause, longer. "I'm going to leave the camera running. If anyone finds this..." He stops, looks past the camera into the darkness beyond, then backs away, slowly, his headlamp beam swinging across the carved symbols on the walls. His final words, "Something's down here with me. It's been watching this whole time." The camera continues recording until the battery dies 23 minutes later. The frame shows only darkness and the faint sound of water dripping. No screams, no struggle, just silence. According to the legend, the chamber was resealed within 48 hours. The footage was classified. Engineers who accessed the chamber were required to sign non-disclosure agreements. Official statements attributed the radar anomaly to instrument malfunction and denied any discovery of human remains or evidence of Marcus Chen. The story has every element that makes internet mysteries go viral. An expert victim whose competence makes his fate more mysterious. An impossible survival timeline. Ancient, unexplained markings suggesting something pre-human. Found footage that conveniently explains itself. And a government cover-up that accounts for the lack of evidence. It's compelling. It's terrifying. It's shared thousands of times across platforms. And it's completely fiction. But to understand why this specific legend took root, why it's set in Nutty Putty Cave, why the details feel plausible, why people believe it despite the absence of any verification, we need to examine the real cave and the very real tragedy that led to its permanent closure. Nutty Putty Cave sits in a hillside west of Utah Lake, roughly 55 miles south of Salt Lake City. To look at the entrance, you'd never guess its reputation. No dramatic cliff face, no gaping mouth in a mountainside, just a modest opening in sloping terrain, surrounded by sagebrush and juniper, marked by a simple gate. The cave earned its name from the brown, putty-like clay that coated the interior walls, soft, slick, and disturbingly organic to the touch. It was a hydrothermal cave, formed not by the gradual dissolution of limestone by surface water, but by superheated groundwater that forced its way upward through cracks in the bedrock, dissolving rock from below and creating a chaotic, unpredictable network of passages. That formation process produced a cave unlike the spacious caverns featured in tourism brochures. Nutty Putty was a maze of tight, twisting corridors, some barely wide enough to accommodate a human body, others requiring awkward contortions to navigate. The passages intersected at odd angles, doubled back on themselves, and occasionally dead-ended without warning. And yet, it was considered a beginner cave. Throughout the 1960s and 1970s, Nutty Putty became a popular destination for Boy Scout troops, church youth groups, and college students looking for accessible adventure. Its proximity to urban areas and reputation as challenging but safe made it ideal for introducing novices to caving. Guidebooks described it as suitable for families. The thrill of squeezing through tight spaces, of navigating in darkness with only headlamps, felt adventurous without seeming genuinely dangerous. The passages had names that reflected this casual familiarity, but also hinted at the cave's nature. The birth canal described a particularly narrow section where cavers had to exhale completely to squeeze through, emerging as if being born into the chamber beyond. The Scout Eater referenced the many young scouts who'd panicked halfway through its constricted length. Ed's Push memorialized a caver named Ed who'd been the first to force his way through a nearly impossible compression. These weren't official designations on geological surveys. They were nicknames, passed between cavers, marking territories of struggle. Getting stuck was common enough that local rescue teams knew the cave intimately. Throughout the 1990s and early 2000s, emergency calls came in several times a year. Someone wedged in the birth canal. Someone turned around in the wrong passage and unable to reverse their position. Someone experiencing a panic attack in a space too tight to turn their head. Most of these incidents ended successfully. Experienced cavers would talk the trapped person through controlled breathing, guide them in tiny incremental movements, sometimes spending hours coaching them centimeter by centimeter until they worked free. But the frequency of rescues strained resources. In 2006, after a particularly difficult extraction that required specialized equipment and over 20 volunteers working for 9 hours to free a teenage boy from a vertical slot, the landowner who controlled access to the cave made the decision to close it. A gate was installed. The caving community protested. Nutty Putty was a training ground, a rite of passage, a place where hundreds had learned to move through stone. The closure lasted 3 years. In 2009, new management took over. A more sophisticated gate system was installed, designed to limit access while still permitting experienced cavers with proper equipment. New liability waivers were implemented. There was discussion of creating better maps, of marking the most dangerous passages, of establishing a buddy system requirement. The cave reopened that spring. On November 24, 2009, Thanksgiving night, John Edward Jones and his brother entered through the new gate system for what they expected to be a nostalgic trip through a cave they'd explored years earlier. The geology that had made Nutty Putty famous for its tight passages, the hydrothermal formation that created its labyrinthine complexity, the slick clay coating that gave it its name. All of these factors were about to converge in the worst possible way. Within hours, John would be trapped in a space that wasn't marked on any map, wedged upside down in a crevice that would become his tomb. And the cave that had been someone's idea of family-friendly adventure would become the center of one of the most desperate and heartbreaking rescue operations in American caving history. John Edward Jones kissed his wife Emily goodbye on the evening of November 24th, 2009, promising to be home before midnight. He was 26 years old, a second-year medical student at the University of Virginia, the father of a 13-month-old daughter named Lizzie. With another child on the way, he wasn't going far, just to Nutty Putty Cave, about an hour south of Salt Lake City, where he'd explored as a teenager with his family. His younger brother Josh was with him, along with 9 others. A Thanksgiving tradition. A few hours underground, then back to warmth and family. John had everything to live for. By all accounts, he was gentle, faithful, driven. He'd recently been accepted into medical school. He coached youth basketball. He was the kind of man who stopped to help strangers with car trouble. The kind who called his mother every Sunday. At approximately 8 p.m., the group entered the cave. The plan was simple: navigate to a popular section called the Birth Canal, a narrow but manageable passage that experienced cavers enjoyed for the challenge. John had done it before. He knew the cave's layout, or thought he did. But Nutty Putty was a maze of nearly identical tunnels, clay-smeared limestone walls, low ceilings, passages that branched and looped back on themselves. In the darkness, with only headlamps cutting narrow beams through dust, even familiar routes could become disorienting. Around 8:45 p.m., John separated slightly from the group near a section called Ed's Push. He spotted what he believed was the entrance to the birth canal, a tight, descending passage. He'd done this before. He was confident. He called back to Josh that he'd found it. Then he squeezed in head first. The opening was 18 inches wide and 10 inches tall, barely enough space for a grown man's shoulders. John exhaled, flattened himself, and wriggled forward. The passage angled downward at roughly 70 degrees. Not quite vertical, but steep enough that gravity pulled him deeper with each movement. He slid forward, then farther. The walls pressed against his chest, his hips, his thighs. And then he realized, this wasn't the birth canal. This was an unmapped fissure, a dead-end crevice that didn't appear on any cave diagram, a vertical coffin of limestone barely wider than his body. He tried to push himself backward. His arms were pinned at his sides. His legs, bent at the knees, couldn't generate leverage against the slick clay coating the rock. Every attempt to move only wedged him tighter. By 9 p.m., John Edward Jones was trapped upside down, 400 feet from the cave entrance, in a space so narrow that rescuers would later describe it as tighter than a birth canal. Suspended at a 70-degree angle, head lower than feet, arms locked against his torso, legs folded awkwardly in the tight vertical shaft above him. Josh realized something was wrong when John stopped responding. He crawled to the opening, shined his light down, and saw his brother's feet, disappearing into a crevice that shouldn't exist. "I'm stuck," John said. His voice was calm, almost apologetic. Josh tried to pull him out by his legs. John screamed. The movement drove him deeper. Josh stopped immediately. At 9:30 p.m., one of the group crawled out of the cave and called 911. The physics of John's situation were medieval in their cruelty. Inverted, gravity forced blood to pool in his head and upper torso. His heart, already working against the unnatural angle, strained to pump blood back upward through his body. His lungs, compressed by his own body weight and the constricting rock, could only inflate partially with each breath. Medical literature is clear. The human body is not designed to hang upside down for extended periods. Blood pressure in the head rises. Intracranial pressure builds. The heart muscle fatigues. Breathing becomes shallow, then labored, then desperate. In ideal conditions, with proper circulation and no compression, a healthy person might survive inverted for several hours before serious damage occurs. John was not in ideal conditions. His chest was compressed, his arms immobilized. The rock pressed against his ribcage with every attempted breath, fighting the expansion of his lungs. Each inhalation required active effort. Each exhalation offered no relief because the pressure remained constant. And he was alone in the dark, 100 feet below the surface, in a space so confined that no one could reach him without risking the same fate. By 10 p.m., the first rescuers arrived at the cave entrance. By 11 p.m., they'd navigated the tight passages and made voice contact with John. He was conscious, coherent, frightened but trying to stay calm. "I'm okay," he told them. "Just get me out." They promised they would. Over the next hour, more rescuers arrived. Cave rescue specialists, firefighters, paramedics, engineers, Over 100 volunteers would eventually participate in the effort to save John Jones. They assessed the situation and understood immediately. This would not be a simple extraction. The passage was too narrow to fit anyone beside him, too vertical to approach from below. The rock walls were soft limestone, prone to crumbling under stress. Any attempt to drill or chisel risked collapsing the entire crevice, with John still inside. But they had to try. They fed a radio down to him so he could communicate. They passed down water bottles, which he sipped awkwardly, fighting gravity to swallow. They kept talking to him, keeping his spirits up, assuring him they had a plan. And they did have a plan. An ambitious, desperate, impossibly complex plan involving rope and pulley systems, anchor bolts drilled into limestone, and a coordinated effort to slowly, carefully, pull John Edward Jones back up through the passage that had swallowed him. It was now Wednesday, November 25th, 2009, shortly after midnight, Thanksgiving Day. John had been upside down for 3 hours. The human cardiovascular system assumes you'll spend most of your life upright. When you're inverted, everything reverses. Blood that normally requires effort to pump upward to the brain now rushes there freely, driven by gravity. The heart, evolved to fight against downward pull, suddenly finds itself overwhelmed by fluid it cannot efficiently return. John Edward Jones hung head down at a 70-degree angle in a limestone vise, 10 inches wide. Within the first hour, his face would have begun to flush as blood pooled in the capillaries of his head and neck. Pressure built behind his eyes. His sinuses filled. The sensation, survivors of similar ordeals describe it as a throbbing fullness, a feeling that your skull might split from internal pressure. His heart rate elevated, trying to compensate, pulse pounding in his temples, each beat pushing more blood into a circulatory system that couldn't drain properly. Then came the breathing. Suspended upside down, John's abdominal, organs, stomach, liver, intestines, shifted downward under gravity, pressing against his diaphragm from the wrong direction. Simultaneously, the rock walls compressed his chest. His ribcage, designed to expand outward with each breath, had nowhere to go. Inhalation became active labor. He had to fight his own body weight, his own organs, and the stone pressing against him just to draw air into partially collapsed lungs. Shallow breaths, rapid and insufficient. His blood oxygen levels would have started to drop within the first 2 hours. Rescuers who reached him described hearing his breathing. Quick, strained, the sound of someone struggling against an invisible weight. And there was nothing he could do to relieve it. He couldn't shift position, couldn't stretch, couldn't rotate his torso even an inch. The crevice held him in a geometric prison that permitted no movement except the minor flexing of his legs, still bent at the knees in the shaft above him. His arms were pinned, flat against his sides, completely useless. By hour 4, the pain would have intensified, not from injury, but from position. Muscles locked in unnatural angles, joints bearing weight they weren't designed to support, blood pooling in tissues that had no way to drain. The rescuers knew all of this. They knew that every minute John remained inverted, his chances of survival decreased. Even if they extracted him, even if they pulled him out perfectly intact, the damage accumulating inside his body might be irreversible. Cardiac arrest, stroke, organ failure, crushed lung tissue. These were the outcomes medical literature predicted for prolonged inversion. But they also knew something else. John Edward Jones was still alive, still conscious, still talking to them through the radio they'd passed down. He asked about his wife, about his daughter. He told rescuers he could feel his legs going numb. He apologized for causing so much trouble. One rescuer, Susie Matola, squeezed through the tight passage until she could see John's legs. She couldn't reach him. The gap was too narrow. But she talked to him, kept him focused, reminded him that his family was waiting. "We're going to get you out," she promised. And they believed it. They had to. The plan was engineering improvisation under impossible conditions. Rescuers drilled anchor bolts into the limestone walls surrounding the crevice. They rigged a rope and pulley system, threading lines down through the passage. The goal: attach a harness around John's legs and slowly, incrementally, winch him upward. But first, they had to reach him. Ryan Schertz, one of the first rescuers on scene, managed to navigate the passage far enough to touch John's foot. He worked in near total darkness, the space so confined he could barely move his arms. He tied webbing around John's ankles, creating a makeshift harness. It took hours. By early Wednesday morning, Thanksgiving Day, they were ready to attempt the first pull. A team of rescuers manned the pulley system. On the count, they hauled on the ropes. The webbing went taut. John's body shifted, moved, rose slightly in the crevice. For a few minutes, it worked. They were pulling him out, inch by agonizing inch, fighting gravity and friction and the unforgiving geometry of stone. Rescuers cheered. John, barely conscious now after 8 hours inverted, managed a weak acknowledgement. Then a sound like a gunshot echoed through the passage. One of the anchor bolts, drilled into soft limestone under enormous tension, ripped free from the wall. The pulley system failed. John slid back down into the crevice. Deeper than before, the webbing around his ankles pulled tight, but with no anchor point, there was nothing to stop his descent. He dropped farther into the fissure, wedged tighter, now even more compressed than when they'd started. The rescuers stared at the failed anchor point, at the fresh scar in the limestone where the bolt had torn free. They tried to regroup, tried to rig another system, but the rock around the crevice was failing. Every new bolt they drilled risked the same catastrophic failure, and John's condition was deteriorating rapidly. By hour 12, he was drifting in and out of consciousness. His speech slurred. His breathing grew shallower. The rescuers kept talking to him, kept him awake as long as they could. But the medical reality was inescapable. His heart, forced to pump against gravity for over half a day, was failing. His lungs, compressed and starved of full expansion, couldn't oxygenate his blood. His brain, swollen with excess fluid, was shutting down. At approximately 11 p.m. on November 25th, roughly 27 hours after he first became trapped, John Edward Jones stopped responding to rescuers. His breathing ceased. His heart, exhausted beyond recovery, stopped beating. Rescuers performed CPR as best they could in the impossible space, reaching down to compress his chest through the narrow gap, but they couldn't get the angle, couldn't generate effective compressions, couldn't reverse what gravity and time had done. John Edward Jones was pronounced dead at 11:57 p.m. He was 26 years old. He'd been trapped upside down in a space 18 inches wide for 27 hours and 52 minutes. And now, the rescuers faced a new, horrifying question. How do you recover a body from a place where living rescuers can barely reach? The first rescuer reached John Jones at 12:30 a.m. on November 25th. Roughly 90 minutes after his brother Josh emerged from the cave and triggered the emergency response. Susie Matola, an experienced cave rescuer with the Utah County Sheriff's search and rescue team, squeezed through the same narrow passage John had mistaken for the birth canal. When her headlamp finally illuminated his legs, the only part of him visible, she found him wedged in a space so tight she could barely maneuver her own body to assess the situation. "Can you hear me? My name is Susie. We're going to get you out." John's voice came back muffled, compressed by his own body weight pressing against his chest. "I can't feel my legs anymore." He'd been inverted for nearly 3 hours. The blood pooling in his skull was building dangerous pressure. His lungs, compressed by gravity and the vice-like grip of limestone, couldn't fully expand. Each breath required conscious effort. Each heartbeat fought against, a cardiovascular system forced to work in reverse. But he was alive. He was conscious. And that meant they could save him. The rescue team established a staging area at the entrance to the narrow passage. They designated it the platform, a wider section of tunnel where equipment could be organized and rescuers could rotate through. The plan required precision engineering executed in near total darkness, in spaces where a grown man couldn't turn around, with a victim whose position made every intervention a calculated risk. By 2 a.m., they'd threaded the first rope system through the passage. The design was elegant in theory. A series of pulleys anchored to the cave walls would distribute John's weight across multiple points, allowing rescuers to pull him upward in controlled increments. They drilled bolts directly into the limestone, testing each anchor point with their own body weight before trusting it with John's life. The problem was access. Only 1 or 2 rescuers could work in the narrow crevice at a time. They had to squeeze in beside John, rig the rope harness around his legs and lower torso, then retreat before the next phase could begin. The cave's temperature, a constant 55 degrees, felt frigid against sweat-soaked clothing. The clay coating every surface made grips treacherous. At 3:15 a.m., they achieved the first small victory. They'd secured a harness around John's lower body and attached it to the pulley system. The team coordinated their effort. Rescuers positioned throughout the passage, each managing a different segment of rope, communicating through shouted updates that echoed through the limestone corridors. On 3. 1, 2, 3. Pull. John moved. Not much. Perhaps an inch, maybe 2. But it was upward movement. His body shifted against the rock that had held him immobile for 5 hours. Again. 1, 2, 3. Another inch. The impossible was becoming possible. The physics that had doomed him were being reversed through engineering and human determination. They fed him water through a tube. They kept talking to him, keeping his mind focused on his wife, Emily, on his daughter, on Thanksgiving dinner waiting for him above ground. By 8 a.m., they'd moved him nearly a foot. His face was visible now. Rescuers could see him, could read the exhaustion in his eyes, but also the hope. He'd been trapped for 10 hours, but he was coming out. The rope system was working. They planned their next pull for 8:30 a.m., after a brief rest to assess the anchor points and adjust the rope configuration. The drilled bolts had held through a dozen pulls. The limestone, despite its clay coating, had proven solid. The team's spirits lifted. Rescuers who'd worked through the night called their families with cautious optimism. At 8:32 a.m., the anchor point failed. Not the bolt, the rock itself. A section of limestone the size of a dinner plate, containing the primary anchor bolt, separated from the cave wall, with a crack that echoed through the passage like a gunshot. The rope system, instantly unbalanced, went slack. John dropped. Not far, perhaps 8 inches, but it was enough. The brief upward progress reversed. His body slid deeper into the crevice, the additional pressure forcing his arms, which had been pinned at his sides, into an even more compressed position. The harness, still attached but now slack, offered no purchase for another attempt. The rescuers heard him scream, a sound muffled by rock and the compression of his chest, but unmistakable in its despair. They spent the next 6 hours trying to rig a new system. They drilled additional anchor points, tested different configurations, consulted with structural engineers by radio. But the geometry had changed. John was now deeper, more tightly wedged, and the passage offered no solid rock for new anchors at the angles they needed. By mid-afternoon, the medical realities became unavoidable. John had been inverted for 16 hours. His speech had become slurred. His periods of consciousness were growing shorter. The rescue coordinator made radio contact with trauma physicians at Utah Valley Regional Medical Center, describing the patient's condition, his vital signs, the duration of inversion. The doctor's assessment was clinical and devastating. Even if they extracted him in the next hour, the damage to his brain and cardiovascular system would likely be catastrophic. The shock of returning to an upright position after such prolonged inversion could trigger immediate cardiac arrest. But they didn't stop. They couldn't. John Jones was alive, and while he was alive, they had to try. Fresh rescue teams rotated in, replacing volunteers who'd worked through the night. They brought specialized equipment from Salt Lake City, inflatable airbags designed to create space in collapsed buildings, diamond-tipped drill bits for harder rock, pharmaceutical-grade oxygen to keep John alert. At 11 p.m. on November 25th, nearly 24 hours after the first rescuer reached him, John Jones was still breathing, still occasionally responding to questions, still trapped in the same vertical crevice that had held him since 8:45 p.m. the previous night. The rescuers kept talking to him, kept telling him about his family waiting above, kept promising that the next attempt would work. Some of them had been in that passage for 12-hour shifts, had squeezed themselves into spaces barely wider than their shoulders, had spoken to John face to face and looked into his eyes and made promises they desperately wanted to keep. They were lying beside a man who was dying by degrees, and there was nothing they could do to stop it. At 11:57 p.m. on November the 25th, 2009, John Edward Jones stopped responding to rescuers' voices. His legs, the only part of him visible to the teams working in the narrow passage, had gone completely still. The slight movements, the flexing of muscles, the involuntary shifts that had persisted through 27 hours of entrapment, ceased. The rescuer closest to him, a volunteer named Jason Hodgson, squeezed forward until he could reach John's ankle. He pressed 2 fingers against the skin, searching for a pulse in the posterior tibial artery. Nothing. He tried again, repositioning his hand, applying more pressure. The cave's temperature made it difficult to distinguish body heat from cold stone. He waited a full minute, his own pulse hammering in his ears, before keying his radio. Platform, this is Hodgson. I've got no pulse. Repeat, no pulse detected. The rescue coordinator, stationed at the entrance to the narrow passage, took 17 seconds to respond. Confirm no pulse. Can you attempt CPR? Hodgson looked at the space around him, a limestone tube barely 18 inches wide, with John's body wedged vertically, head down, in a position that offered no access to his chest or airway. Negative. No room to work. No way to position. Even if Hodgson could have reached John's chest, the physics made resuscitation impossible. Effective CPR requires a firm surface beneath the patient's back. John was suspended in rock, his chest compressed by his own body weight and the cave walls. There was no way to create the force needed for compressions, no way to establish an airway, no way to reverse the cardiovascular collapse that had been building for more than a day. A physician with cave rescue experience, Dr. Michael Logue, had been monitoring the situation by radio from the staging area outside the cave. He'd been listening to updates throughout the rescue, tracking John's declining vital signs, preparing for this moment, even as he hoped it wouldn't come. When the report of no pulse reached him, he consulted briefly with the emergency physicians at Utah Valley Regional Medical Center. Then he made the declaration that every rescuer already knew was coming. This is Dr. Logue. Based on patient presentation, duration of entrapment, and inability to access or resuscitate, I'm calling time of death at 0005 hours, November 26, 2009. All rescue personnel should prepare to withdraw since 27 hours and 20 minutes after entering the unmapped crevice. John Jones' heart had stopped. The sustained inversion, the compression of his chest and abdomen, the pooling of blood in his brain, and the gradually failing cardiovascular system had created a cascade of physiological failures that no amount of determination could reverse. Cardiac arrest, the official cause of death would state, but the mechanism was more complex than that clinical term suggested. His heart hadn't simply stopped, it had been slowly crushed by the accumulated strain of fighting gravity in a position the human body was never designed to sustain. The rescuers in the passage didn't move immediately. Some of them had been talking to John less than an hour earlier. They'd heard his voice, muffled and weak but still present. They'd told him about the next attempt, about the new equipment coming, about his family waiting. They'd made promises. Hodgson, still pressed against the cave wall, inches from John's legs, stayed in position for another 3 minutes. Later, he would tell investigators he kept checking for a pulse, certain he must have missed it, certain that the cold and the awkward angle had simply made detection difficult. But there was nothing. The body that had fought so hard for so long had surrendered to physics and biology. The withdrawal took hours. Over 100 volunteers had cycled through the rescue operation, many of them still stationed throughout the cave's passages. Equipment had to be retrieved. Rope systems had to be dismantled. The teams working closest to John's body had to squeeze backward through spaces that required them to exhale completely, just to move. By 4 a.m., the last rescuer emerged from Nutty Putty Cave. John Edward Jones remained inside, suspended in the same vertical crevice he'd entered 28 hours earlier, now alone in the darkness that would become permanent. At the staging area outside the cave entrance, volunteers sat in stunned silence. Many were experienced rescue workers who'd participated in dozens of operations. They'd pulled people from collapsed buildings, extracted victims from car wrecks, rappelled down cliff faces to reach stranded hikers. But this was different. They'd had contact with the victim. They'd communicated with him, coordinated with him, kept his spirits up with conversations about his family and his future. They'd been so close, had actually moved him upward, had seen his face, had believed the engineering would work. And then they'd watched the anchor fail, and the mathematics of the situation shift from difficult to impossible. The psychological aftermath would linger for years. Several rescuers would require counseling. Some would leave cave rescue work entirely, unable to face the possibility of similar failures. The ones who stayed would carry John's death as a reminder that expertise and equipment and determination don't always overcome geology. At 6:30 a.m., as dawn broke over Utah Valley, sheriff's deputies contacted Emily Jones with the news that her husband was gone. She'd spent the previous day at a local church with family members, fielding updates from the rescue coordinator, maintaining hope even as the reports grew increasingly grim. She was 24 years old, her daughter was 13 months old, and her husband's body was entombed in the limestone in a position that made recovery functionally impossible without risking additional lives. The tragedy of John Edward Jones wasn't just his death, it was the manner of it. Slow, conscious, surrounded by people trying desperately to help but constrained by physics they couldn't overcome. He'd had time to understand what was happening, time to think about what he was leaving behind, time to experience every stage of hope and fear and resignation. The rescuers who'd been with him in those final hours reported that he never blamed them, never expressed anger at the situation. He'd thanked them for trying. He'd asked them to tell his family he loved them. He'd maintained composure even as his body failed, even as the darkness closed in. That composure, that grace in the face of an unthinkable fate, made the failure hurt more. They'd been trying to save someone who deserved saving. Someone who'd done everything right except make one navigational error in a cave that offered no margin for mistakes. By mid-morning on November 26th, the question facing authorities was no longer how to save John Jones. It was what to do with his body, trapped in a passage so dangerous that the rescue operation itself had nearly claimed additional lives. The answer would require making a decision unprecedented in modern American cave rescue history. After 27 hours of exhausting rescue efforts, John Edward Jones was gone. But the nightmare facing authorities, rescue coordinators, and John's family was far from over. Because now they confronted a question no one wanted to answer. What happens to the body of a man who died in a place no one can safely reach? The passage where John remained trapped was barely wide enough for a human body. The vertical descent, the 70-degree angle, the unstable rock that had already failed once during rescue attempts. Every factor that made saving him impossible made recovering him equally impossible. Susie Matola, who had coordinated much of the rescue operation, gathered with county officials and technical rescue specialists in the days following John's death. The discussion was clinical, out of necessity, but the weight of it pressed on everyone in the room. Could they send another team back into that passage? Could they risk additional lives to retrieve someone who had already been lost? The answer, painful as it was, kept coming back the same way. No. We'd be putting rescuers in the exact same position that killed John, one technical specialist stated in the closed meeting. Same passage, same angle, same risks. The rock structure had already proven unstable. We'd broken an anchor point trying to pull him out. What happens when we try to extract a body that's been wedged there for days? The medical realities compounded the problem. John had been trapped in that position for over a day. The physiological effects of prolonged inversion, the pressure, the positioning. His body had endured trauma that would make any extraction attempt even more mechanically difficult than the original rescue. Then there was the simple, brutal physics of it. The passage that had trapped him was so tight that rescuers could barely reach him to provide comfort. How would they attach rigging? Where would leverage come from? What anchor points could they trust after the failure that had sent him sliding deeper? The Utah County Sheriff's Office consulted with cave rescue experts from across the country. They reviewed the incident reports, examined the passage diagrams, analyzed the failed rescue attempt. Every expert reached the same conclusion. Attempting recovery would almost certainly result in another death. But this wasn't a decision that could be made on technical grounds alone. John's family, his wife Emily, his parents, his siblings, faced an unimaginable choice. Their son, their husband, their brother was still in that cave. The idea of leaving him there, of never bringing him home, violated every instinct. Families are supposed to bury their dead. They're supposed to have a place to visit, to mourn, to remember. Emily Jones, in particular, carried a burden no new mother should ever bear. She had an infant daughter who would never know her father. How do you explain to a child that daddy is still in a cave because it was too dangerous to bring him back? But the alternative was worse. The alternative was asking other husbands, other fathers, other sons to risk dying in the same passage. The alternative was potentially creating more widows, more orphans, more families destroyed by the same unforgiving geology. The family made their decision with extraordinary grace. John would remain where he was. Nutty Putty Cave would become his final resting place. That decision immediately created another question. What do you do with a cave that contains human remains? You can't leave it open. You can't allow other cavers, people who didn't know what had happened, or worse, people seeking the morbid thrill of visiting a death site, to enter passages near where John's body rested. The only option was permanent closure. In early December 2009, less than 2 weeks after John's death, officials made the announcement. Nutty Putty Cave would be sealed forever. The entrance would be filled with concrete, eliminating any possibility of future entry. The entire cave system, over 1,400 feet of mapped passages, a beloved recreation site that had hosted thousands of visitors, would be closed permanently. The decision sparked immediate debate. Some cavers argued that closing the entire cave system was an overreaction, that sealing just the passage where John died would be sufficient. Others pointed out that Nutty Putty had already proven deadly, that its deceptive layout and tight passages would inevitably claim more lives if left accessible. The Jones family requested the closure. That ended the debate. The county moved quickly. The cave entrance, that innocuous opening in the hillside that had swallowed so many cavers over the years, was filled with tons of concrete. The seal wasn't symbolic. It was absolute. Steel-reinforced concrete, poured deep, making the entrance impassable. And then, in a final act of transformation, the county installed a memorial plaque at the site. The plaque is simple: black metal, white lettering. It identifies the location as the Nutty Putty Cave Memorial, and it carries a dedication to John Edward Jones. The text doesn't explain how he died. It doesn't detail the rescue efforts or the impossible decisions that followed. It simply marks the place as his resting place, asks visitors to respect the site, and reminds anyone who finds it that a real person, a husband, a father, a son, a brother, is entombed in the rock beneath their feet. The sealing operation took several days. Workers hauled concrete, mixed up the hillside, poured it into the entrance, reinforced it with steel, and poured more. The goal wasn't just to block casual entry. The goal was to make the cave impossible to access without industrial equipment and considerable effort. Effort that would be immediately visible and could be stopped. By mid-December 2009, Nutty Putty Cave had ceased to exist as an accessible location. The entrance was gone. The passages were sealed off from the surface. The air trapped inside would never circulate with outside atmosphere again. The cave had become a tomb in the most literal sense. The community response was complicated. Many local cavers mourned the loss of Nutty Putty. Despite its dangers, it had been a training ground, a recreational site, a place where people had created memories. The cave's closure meant those experiences were now locked away, inaccessible to future generations. But there was also widespread support for the decision. The same community that loved the cave understood that some places become too dangerous, too haunted by tragedy, to remain open. John's death had proven that Nutty Putty's deceptive passages could kill even experienced, cautious cavers. How many more families needed to be destroyed before the risk outweighed the recreation? The Jones family visited the memorial site after the sealing was complete. Emily brought their daughter. They stood at the plaque, at the concrete seal, knowing that just below, somewhere in the darkness and stone, John remained. It wasn't the closure that families typically receive. There was no funeral with an open casket, no burial plot in a peaceful cemetery, just rock and concrete and a mountain that would never give him back. But there was something else too. There was the knowledge that John's death had meaning beyond the tragedy. The cave's permanent closure meant no one else would die there. No other family would receive the midnight phone call. No other rescue teams would spend sleepless nights in those passages, fighting geology and time and gravity for a life they couldn't save. The memorial transformed Nutty Putty from a recreational cave into a monument. And in doing so, it created something that the cave had never been during its decades of use: a mystery. Because here's what happens when you seal a place under tragic circumstances. Here's what happens when you pour concrete over an entrance and declare a location permanently off-limits. The human mind doesn't accept closed forever without filling in the gaps. The sealed entrance became a focal point for speculation. What's really down there? What did they seal away? Is it just John's body? Or is there something else the authorities don't want people to find? The internet, predictably, had answers. The forums where cavers gathered to discuss Nutty Putty's history began collecting stories that didn't quite match the official record. Someone claimed their uncle was part of the rescue team and saw strange markings on the walls near where John was trapped. Someone else insisted the cave was sealed so quickly because authorities found something they couldn't explain. And slowly, steadily, the legend began to grow. This is where Marcus Chen was born. Not in 2011. Not in any real cave expedition, but in the collective imagination of people who looked at a sealed cave memorial and decided the official story wasn't complete. The creepypasta. The internet legend of the experienced spelunker who survived for years in a hidden chamber, documenting ancient markings before whispering about something watching him in the darkness, emerged directly from the real-world ceiling of Nutty Putty Cave. The fiction borrowed heavily from the facts. A cave sealed permanently, real, impossible to access, real. Someone trapped inside, real. But the legend twisted those facts, adding layers of supernatural horror, government conspiracy, and found footage drama that transformed a tragedy into entertainment. The Marcus Chen story is effective because it builds on a foundation of truth. Nutty Putty Cave is sealed. There is a body inside. Authorities did make the decision to close it permanently. Those facts are verifiable. But the story adds an impossible chamber that doesn't exist, ancient markings that were never found, and years of survival that defy medical reality. It transforms a straightforward, if heartbreaking, story into something mysterious and sinister. And that transformation is a betrayal of what actually happened. Because the real story doesn't need ancient markings or hidden chambers to be devastating. The real story doesn't need whispered warnings or classified footage to be meaningful. The real story is that a 26-year-old medical student went into a cave on Thanksgiving night and never came home. The real story is that over 100 people tried desperately to save him and failed. The real story is that his family made an impossible choice with extraordinary grace. The real story is that a mountain became a grave because the alternative was allowing more people to die. That story, the true one, is harder to process than a creepypasta. It's harder because there's no monster to blame, no conspiracy to unravel, no supernatural force that explains the senselessness. There's just geology and bad luck and the fragile limits of the human body. But it's the story that deserves to be remembered. Not Marcus Chen's fictional horror, John Edward Jones's real tragedy. The memorial plaque outside the sealed entrance serves its purpose. It marks the location. It honors John. It asks for respect. But it can't compete with the viral power of a good, scary story, and the internet has proven that fiction spreads faster than fact when the fiction is frightening enough. Marcus Chen never existed. There was no 2011 disappearance, no 5-year mystery, no ground-penetrating radar survey that discovered an impossible chamber behind the concrete seal. The helmet cam footage, the ancient markings, the whispered warning about something watching from the darkness, all fiction, a creepypasta, internet folklore dressed in the language of documentary truth. But the story works. It spreads. People believe it, share it, debate its authenticity in forums and comment sections. They analyze the supposed timeline, speculate about what the markings meant, argue about whether authorities would really classify such evidence. The question is why? Why does this particular fiction take root in a place where real horror already occurred? Why do we need monsters in a cave that already claimed an actual victim? The Marcus Chen legend follows a familiar template. The components are recognizable to anyone versed in internet horror. The experienced expert who falls, victim, lending credibility through competence. The found footage device, creating false authenticity. The ancient mysteries that suggest something older and more sinister than natural disaster. The cryptic final message, the government cover-up that conveniently explains why no evidence can be verified. These aren't random choices. They're the architecture of effective modern folklore. Compare it to Ted the Caver, the pioneering creepypasta from 2001 that established the template. An experienced spelunker discovers a previously unknown passage, documents his exploration through journal entries and photographs, encounters increasingly disturbing phenomena, and ultimately vanishes or meets an ambiguous fate. The format creates plausible deniability. It could be real. The documentation feels authentic. The gradual escalation mirrors how actual cave exploration unfolds. The Marcus Chen story improves the formula by grafting itself onto Nutty Putty's real tragedy. It doesn't invent a fictional cave that skeptics can debunk. It parasitizes a location already weighted with documented horror, already sealed and inaccessible, already wrapped in genuine mystery about what those final hours were like for John Jones. That's what makes it effective. The real elements provide cover for the fictional ones. But there's a deeper psychological mechanism at work. The Marcus Chen story provides what the true story doesn't: an external threat, something watching, something malevolent, an entity that explains the horror through intention rather than accident. That's easier to process than randomness. John Jones died because he misjudged a gap in the rock, because gravity is indifferent, because human anatomy cannot sustain prolonged inversion, because sometimes rescue efforts fail despite heroic attempts, because the universe doesn't care about good intentions, medical school dreams, or the infant daughter waiting at home. There's no monster to blame, no ancient evil, no conspiracy, just stone and physics, and the terrible fragility of human life in spaces we were never meant to occupy. The legend offers comfort disguised as horror. If there's something in the darkness, then the tragedy has meaning. It becomes a cautionary tale about respecting forbidden places, about forces beyond human understanding. The victim becomes a warning rather than simply a casualty of chance. We transform senseless loss into narrative structure because stories are how humans process trauma. We need patterns, causes, reasons. A monster is a reason. Bad luck is just nothing. The real story doesn't need embellishment. No hidden chamber was discovered in 2016. No structural engineers conducted surveys for memorial expansion. The cave remains can be sealed exactly as it was left in late 2009. Concrete barriers, steel gates, a plaque honoring John Edward Jones. No one has entered since. No one will. The Marcus Chen creepypasta serves a function in internet culture. It's collaborative folklore, a shared campfire story for the digital age. As fiction, it's effective. The problem emerges when fiction erases fact, when the legend becomes more searchable than the truth, when people seeking information about Nutty Putty Cave encounter the fabricated story before the real one. That does a disservice to John Edward Jones. His story matters precisely because it's true, because it happened to an actual person who laughed, loved, made plans, had favorite foods and inside jokes and all the ordinary details that constitute a human life. The helmet cam footage that exists isn't classified government material. It's the desperate, exhausted faces of rescuers who spent 27 hours trying impossible engineering solutions in claustrophobic darkness. It's the thermal imaging that showed John's position but couldn't change it. It's the documentation of what failure looks like when every resource has been exhausted. The ancient markings don't exist, but the scratch marks do, made by rescuers' tools against unforgiving limestone, the physical evidence of human determination confronting geological indifference. The whispered warning about something watching isn't on any recording, but John's actual final words to rescuers are documented. Expressions of love for his family, gratitude to those trying to save him, faith that sustained him as his body failed. Those words matter more than any creepypasta dialogue. The conspiracy isn't a cover-up. It's the opposite, a family's choice to share their grief publicly, to advocate for cave safety, to ensure John's death might prevent future tragedies. Emily Jones spoke openly about her husband, about their last conversations, about raising their daughter with memories of a father she barely knew. That's not classified. That's courage. The legend asks us to wonder about government secrets and supernatural forces. The truth asks us to confront harder questions about risk assessment, about the psychology of adventure, about the impossibility of recovering bodies from certain environments, about when we accept that some places will become tombs. John Edward Jones was 26. He had completed his undergraduate degree at Brigham Young University. He was in his first year of medical school at the University of Virginia. He'd been married just over a year. His daughter, Elizabeth, was 13 months old when he died. These aren't dramatic details. They're just facts. But they're the facts that define an actual human loss, not a fictional character's fate. The channel's mission has always been remembering the missing, giving them voice, keeping their stories alive. That mission fails if we let legends overshadow truth. If viral fiction becomes the primary association with a victim's name, if creepypasta gets more engagement than memorial, someone, somewhere, is still remembering John Jones, his family, his former classmates, the rescuers who carry the weight of that night, the cave's safety advocates who reference his case. They deserve a digital landscape where the truth is more prominent than the fiction. The Marcus Chen story will likely persist. Internet legends rarely die completely. They circulate, mutate, resurface in different forms across platforms and years. That's the nature of folklore, but now you know the truth. John Edward Jones is the person who died in Nutty Putty Cave. Not in 2011, in 2009, not in an impossible chamber behind a seal, in a vertical crevice called Ed's Push, where he'd been trying to reach a section called the Birth Canal when he took a wrong turn. There was no classified footage. The helmet cam recordings that exist show the real rescue attempt, the desperate engineering, the physical toll on volunteers working in spaces barely wider than human bodies, the moment the pulley system failed and hope died with it. The cave has been sealed since November 2009. It will remain sealed. John's body is still there, and it always will be. That's not a conspiracy. That's the reality of impossible recovery situations. His widow, Emily, eventually remarried. She's spoken publicly about grief, about healing, about keeping John's memory alive for their daughter. That's the legacy, not internet mythology, but a family's continued love. If this story affected you, share the truth, not the legend. When you see the Marcus Chen creepypasta circulating, add context. Link to the real story. Say John Edward Jones's name. Because someone, somewhere, is still waiting. Not for answers about fictional explorers and imaginary monsters, but for the world to remember an actual person whose final resting place is beneath Utah soil. That's the story worth keeping alive. Subscribe if you want more real cases, real investigations, real people. The missing deserve truth, not embellishment, and the truth is always enough.